Thank you, Father Vince. I'm so pleasantly surprised to see friends from former times. We are experiencing some of the most painful divisions we've ever witnessed in our country, in our church, in our world, while earth melts and leaders struggle to find a way forward. We've heard and seen horrific things, all the more appalling when they've been perpetrated by colleagues and those in trusted positions of leadership. Our institutions are crumbling, and the way we've done things in the past no longer serve. We're in the midst of birth pangs, as God is bringing to birth something new. Most difficult for us now is that we don't yet see what is emerging, how God is drawing us into the future full of promise and hope. To say this is not just rosy-eyed optimism or wishful thinking, but springs from the understanding that the cosmos is evolving toward life to the full. And also our hope is based on what we have seen God do in the past. I think, for example, of our ancestors in faith who watched their temple be utterly destroyed, their land and their women ravaged, their way of life ripped apart as they were dragged into exile. And even then, at that moment, God assured them through the prophet Isaiah, "Behold, I am doing something new. Now it springs forth. Can you not see it?" In our own day, God again speaks these words to us. Whether the new life will be stillborn or thrive into fullness is a choice that lies before us. To co-create with the Holy One a new future, there will need to be a death to former ways of consciousness and former ways of doing things, and a letting go into our self-emptying God, whose love energy infuses the universe. We are at a critical crossroad. What faces us now is far more than how to solve the sex abuse crisis. As Ilia Delio, a Franciscan sister of Washington, D.C., who holds a chair in theology at Villanova University, you know her, yes?
Yes.
You would know her works, certainly. She recently wrote, "A fundamental question is whether the church will accept the world as science now discloses it, or whether we will cling to a church based on, quote, medieval theology, static cosmology, and entrenched dogma, even if dogma contradicts modern science," end quote. She continues, "The choice that lies before us is this, quote, do we want a purified church walled in by unbroken apostolic succession, acosmic spirituality, and patriarchal power? Or do we want a church open to the world and engaged in evolution, where the incarnating presence of God is empowering creative new life? Can we lose what we have clung to in the church for centuries and enter into the darkness of new structures and systems of organization that are inclusive? Do we trust God enough to let go of an imperialized political church and enter into new structures of relationships? Can we trust the spirit of love to energize us to create anew?" End quote. Well, the agenda she sets before us is enormous. And I do not pretend to have a comprehensive roadmap for the way forward. But what I would like to offer tonight is a way of reading the scriptures that can contribute to the shift in consciousness that we will need to adopt in order to co-create with God our new future. So to start off, I want to share with you a story of one of the moments in which my eyes were opened to the ways in which reading the Bible can be deadly when it's really meant to be liberating, yes? So this happened about 20 years ago, and I was teaching a course on the Gospel of Mark. And we got to the climactic midpoint in chapter 8, where Jesus asks his disciples, you know this text, he asks them, who do you say that I am? You remember this scene, right? You remember that finally Peter gets to the right answer, and he says, you are the Messiah. And then Jesus begins to say that he will undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and then rise again. And as Peter struggles with this, Jesus says to the crowd of disciples, if any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. So, you know that I'm a Dominican sister. I belong to the order of preachers. Sometimes that fine line between teaching and preaching is hard to tell which is which. So I was waxing eloquent, maybe preaching more than teaching, on what taking up the cross might mean in a context where most of us would not likely actually face crucifixion. One of my students suddenly raised her hand in the back of the room, and at first I tried to ignore her, but she persisted. I was a little peeved at the interruption, but I finally called on her and asked her, would you like to say something? And she said, yes, I hate that text. And she says, if it were up to me, I would rip it out of the Bible and we would never again hear it proclaimed. Well, that kind of took the wind out of my sails of my preaching. And so I didn't have a clue what she was talking about. And so I asked her if she could please say more about why this was such an awful text. And she says, this is the single most deadly text in the whole Bible. She says, she told me that, and the rest of the class, that she worked in a shelter for women who were victims of domestic violence, and that what happened in the majority of instances when a woman would finally have the courage to say what was happening in her home, she'd usually go to her pastor, her minister, her priest, and he would, more often than not, tell her to go home and submit to her husband, to simply take the abuse as her way of carrying the cross. Submit to her husband, quoting Ephesians 5:22, and endure the abuse as her way of carrying the cross with Jesus. Well, I can tell from your faces that you were as aghast as I was to hear her say such a thing. I had never heard such a misappropriation of the gospel. And so it set me on a path to investigate where is the liberating good news about the death of Jesus. Where is that in the New Testament, particularly for women? This story and many similar ones that I have heard have brought home to me the power of the biblical text. It can be deadly when it is used to justify the oppression of those who are disadvantaged, but it can also be the liberative force that sets captives free. It can be used to justify the status quo and keep inequities and injustices intact, or it can be the destabilizing word that inspires prophets to speak out, and to act out with godly determination for justice. The Bible is never neutral. So as I began to search for liberative ways to understand Jesus' death, one of the things that I did was to ask people everywhere I went, why did Jesus die? Now, this group is very well theologically educated, and if I ask you, why did Jesus die, I'm going to get long, nuanced, complicated, very erudite answers to that. But if you were to ask most folks, most Christians in the pews, what answer do you think they would give? You got it. You got it. I'm hearing it all through the room. You know what it is. Every place I went, the answer was always the same: to save us from our sins. So now this formulation appears a few times in Paul's letters, for instance in 1 Corinthians 15:3, Romans 3:25. But it's not the only, nor even the primary explanation for the death of Jesus in the New Testament. So how did it get so popular? St. Anselm, back in the 11th and 12th century, who formulated atonement, a theology of atonement. Well, this is reducing it to a simplicity that it deserves a much fuller treatment, but just for the sake of simplicity, essentially what he put forward was that human sin was so great that only the death of God's Son could make satisfaction or atonement. As Elizabeth Johnson remarked, St. Anselm should be considered the most successful theologian of all times. His theology stuck. Now, I'd have to go back for a degree in psychology to figure out why. But one of the things that disturbs me about some of the formulations about atonement theology is that it gets us off center. It puts human sin and my guilt in the center of our focus. And it overshadows then God's love. Any theology that we have, any explanation for Jesus' life, death, passion, resurrection, any theology, if it doesn't keep God's love central, then it's not formulated right. If it isn't about God's love, and if it doesn't have the effect of making us more open to love and more loving toward God and toward others, then it's not doing its job. So I want to offer an alternative approach to understanding Jesus' death, and I want to use feminist biblical interpretation. First, though, I want to explain what I mean by feminism and feminist biblical interpretation. And I want to say a few words about when it began, how to do it, and why it's important for both men and women. Now, I have a feeling that this is a bit breviary for this group, but bear with me. There are many definitions of feminism, and some people avoid using the term altogether, thinking that it only means angry, men-hating women who don't want to have anything to do with men and who put men down. That's not how I want to use the term. I want to use it with this definition, that feminism is a perspective and a movement that springs from the recognition of inequalities toward women and advocates for changes in structures that prevent full flourishing of human beings and all creation. Feminists are both women and men who are committed to the struggle for changes in relationship patterns and systems that prevent the full flourishing of all creation. So relationship patterns on one level, systemic change, that's the harder one. You know about it. You're a group very well committed to social justice. You know all about systemic change. So with this understanding of feminism, what is feminist biblical interpretation? Well, first of all, let's talk about when it began. Women interpreting the scriptures through their lenses of their experience and insight is nothing new. Throughout the ages, women have retold biblical stories, teaching them to their children and others, all the while interpreting them afresh for their time and circumstances. We know of some women already back in the 2nd century who were interpreting the Bible through an alternate way, through women's eyes and experience. I'm going to not tell you their whole stories and tempt you to go to the website wisdomcommentary.org, where you can download the introduction to the commentary series that I'm editing. You can download it for free, and you can get the stories of Helie and Beruria. Helie, a Christian woman in the 2nd century, Beruria, a Jewish woman from the 2nd century, who stood up to the prevailing interpretations of their day and said, how about if we look at it this way? But we really don't know of full-blown commentaries on Scripture until the Middle Ages. The first real commentaries would be by Hildegard of Bingen and Julian of Norwich. They were doing what today we would call feminist biblical interpretation. The first person to produce a full-blown feminist commentary on the Bible was Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She was a leading proponent in the U.S. for women's right to vote, but she found that whenever she and other women tried to make inroads into politics, education, or the work world, the Bible was quoted against them. Along with a team of like-minded women, she produced her own commentary on every text of the Bible that concerned women. And her pioneering 2-volume project, The Woman's Bible, published in 1895 and 1898, urges women to recognize that texts that degrade women come from the men who wrote the texts, not from God, and to use their common sense to rethink what has been presented to them as sacred. Since these early foremothers, there has been a steady stream of works by women whose reflections on the Scriptures question prevailing interpretations. It is only in recent decades, however, that women have had greater access to formal theological education and have taken their place in the professional world of biblical scholars. For centuries, the works of female interpreters of the Bible have been largely unknown, both to other women and to their brothers in the synagogues, in the churches, in the academy. But now, women can build on the work of their foremothers and create networks with one another across the globe in ways not previously possible. So let's talk now about what is feminist biblical interpretation and how does one go about it. On the right-hand side of the screen here, it's not necessary for you to be able to read the fine print on the screen. The steps that are there are actually on your handout. But what I wanted you to see in the visual on the right-hand side there is this is a sketch that is from Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza's book, Wisdom Ways, in which she is describing how the steps that we use in doing feminist biblical interpretation are not linear. It's not you start with step 1 and go to step 7 and then you have the right biblical interpretation. Rather, it is an art, and it is like dance steps that interweave. And so it's a more circular movement, how you do feminist biblical interpretation. Let me describe some of these dance steps, and then we'll see where the music takes us. First of all, the first step is that feminist biblical scholars do not start with the text. First, we start with women's experience, both in the past and currently, as our starting point. So, like Latin American liberation theology, that has the 3 movements of ver, buscar, actuar, see, judge, act. You're familiar with that, yes? So you start with what we see in actual life. So we look first at the realities of women's lives and foreground those as we analyze the biblical text. So as we look at the realities of women's life globally in this day and age, although there have been many advances for women in the last few decades, especially in countries that are more developed, there are still so many areas in which there are great inequities toward women. Poverty and wealth, employment and wages, uncompensated labor, education, government, business, healthcare, violence toward women, and church ministries. I wish we had a little bit more time or we'd work a little bit with some of those statistics, but I'm betting that this group is a group that's quite well aware of those. So let me just say that in addressing these kinds of concerns, the Bible can be a great asset when rightly interpreted. a second dance step. As we move toward analyzing the text, we use all the critical exegetical tools developed in modern times: historical criticism, literary criticism, rhetorical criticism, social science criticism, etc. But then we add these kinds of questions. Where were the women? If they aren't mentioned in the text, does that mean they weren't there? I think especially at the Last Supper. Who's got the guest list? And if they aren't mentioned in the text, does that mean they weren't there? How did women in antiquity receive what was written? For example, when Paul wrote to the Corinthians, women must keep silent in church, how did leaders like Deacon Ph.D., mentioned in Romans 16:1 and 2, and teachers and heads of house churches like Prisca react? And then another strategy is the tip of the iceberg strategy. If there was one woman named an apostle in the New Testament, okay, so you didn't know there was going to be a pop quiz, did you? But I bet you all know the answer already. This group would know. Lots of groups never heard of her. You know who the apostle whose name is? Mary. Oh, Junia, thank you. Junia in Romans 16:7. Andronicus and Junia, Paul says, who were notable among the apostles. Maybe then, now we don't know a single thing about them. Now you are right that Mary and the Samaritan woman, Mary Magdalene and the Samaritan woman and others are portrayed as apostles. Apostle means one sent, yes. But the only one actually called an apostle in the New Testament is Junia. So our strategy is, if there was one, there surely must have been more, right? And we bring to our study questions about who wrote the text, for whom, in what circumstances, and with what purpose. Now you'll recognize those as historical critical questions. But when we add a feminist lens, then we recognize that for the most part, the Bible was written by men, for men, about men, and to serve men's interests. Now, our interest here is not to denigrate men. It is simply to call attention to the historical realities behind how the text was constructed and who's been interpreting it mostly in official capacities for the last 2,000 years. Feminist biblical scholars not only try to recover the lost and overlooked history of women in biblical times, but also expose the brutality of violence against women in texts of terror, that phrase coined by Phyllis Tribble, such as the story of the rape and dismemberment of concubine in Judges 19. So this strategy says, rather than tear those stories out of the Bible, like my student wanted to do, we tell them, but with this intent, with the insistence, never again. We also attend to the importance of socio-cultural context. The lenses that a white, well-educated North American woman like me brings to the text are very different from those, for example, of indigenous poor women in rural Mexico who might have very little experience beyond her male-dominated village. Some feminists have coined other terms to highlight the distinctiveness of their context. Many African American feminists, for example, call themselves womanist to draw attention to the double oppression of racism and sexism that they experience. Similarly, many U.S. Hispanic feminists speak of themselves as mujeristas. Mujer, of course, is the word for woman in Spanish. Others, though, prefer to be called Latina feminists. Some feminists prefer to be called eco-feminists, highlighting rightly the fact that the struggle for women's equality and dignity is intimately connected with the struggle for respect for Earth and for the whole of the cosmos. Finally, feminist biblical interpreters attend carefully to the world in front of the text. That is, how is the text heard and appropriated in contemporary contexts today? We ask, what does the text do to those who accept it? Does it reinforce domination and oppression, or does it liberate for flourishing of life? And the final question is, so what? Feminist biblical interpretation is not solely an intellectual exercise. It provides the impetus for transformative action that changes relationship patterns and dismantles structures that are oppressive toward women and other disadvantaged persons. Engaging all the powers of creative imagination, we dream of a world in which there is equality and dignity for all, and we work to make it a reality. Now, I also want to highlight that the work of feminist biblical interpretation is not only by or for women. Men who choose to identify with and partner with feminist women in the work of deconstructing systems of domination and building structures of equality are rightly regarded as feminists also. Some men readily identify with the experience of women who are discriminated against on the basis of sex or gender, having themselves had comparable experiences, either on the basis of racial discrimination or another kind of discrimination. Others who may not have faced direct discrimination or stereotyping recognize that inequity and problematic characterization still occur, and they seek correction. But one little distinction, and that is that men feminists will, as open and as inclusive and as identifying with and walking with women on this path, will never have the same exact experience of being discriminated against solely on the basis of their gender. My colleague Steve Bevins at Catholic Theological Union teaches theology and missiology, and we team teach a course every other year in feminist hermeneutics in Bible and theology. I'm Bible, he's theology. And whenever we are teaching this course together, he always tells our students that he is a feminist, and he is a very strong feminist, and readily admits to it. But he'll always tell the students, but I'll always be like a resident alien. Because he says, I cannot experience the discrimination that women experience just on the basis of being a woman. Okay, so now you've got all the tools, you've got all the dance steps. Are you ready to try it out? Yeah. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to go back to that text of taking up the cross, and I'd like to do a little an exegetical experiment with you of where is the liberating way through to understand the cross using feminist lenses. We go back to Mark 8:34 again. If anyone wants to be my follower, let that one deny him or herself and take up their cross and follow me. There are two important things that we can see from the context where that text is in Mark's gospel. First of all, when Jesus is talking to his disciples about taking up the cross, he's talking about a very specific kind of suffering. He's not talking about every kind of suffering that there is, but one very specific kind. He's referring to the negative repercussions to which disciples are willing to expose themselves as a direct consequence of following Jesus. So he's not talking about the kind of suffering that comes from illness or disease, for example. That can befall anyone. You don't have to be a Christian to get cancer, for example. Now, I know some of you must work in healthcare. Some of you are probably chaplains. And so I would suggest, though, that Christians derive a great deal of comfort by identifying our suffering with that of Jesus's on the cross. It's probably not the right moment at a person's sick bed to say, no, 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 that's not really the cross, what you're enduring. The cross is really what you endure as a consequence of being a disciple. That's probably not the moment to make that distinction for folks. You see what I'm saying? But, so he's not talking about every kind of suffering. He's especially not talking about suffering, about bearing in silence the suffering that comes from injustice. He spent his whole lifetime battling such. Another element that's extremely important is that of free choice. When Jesus spoke to his disciples about taking up the cross, he's talking to people who have a freedom of choice. He's not talking to people who have suffering imposed on them. Rather, these disciples have the power to choose whether or not to follow him and to expose themselves to the potential negative consequences for doing so. When women and other abused persons have suffering imposed on them, this is not properly the cross. One who did take up the cross and pay the ultimate penalty for it, I think so clearly, was Monsignor Oscar Romero, who we canonized yesterday. That's the kind of suffering that Jesus is asking disciples, would you be willing to expose yourself to that? Not go looking for it, but would you be willing to expose yourself to the negative repercussions for being identified with him and his way? I want to leave the Gospel of Mark now and turn our attention to the Gospel of John, where there are several different metaphors that we don't find in the Synoptic Gospels for understanding the cross. And I want to put them under the umbrella of self-surrender to love. That's an expression that Elizabeth Moltmann-Wendell put forward for us. She explains that in contrast to atoning sacrifice, self-surrender is an act of one's own free will. It's bound up with responsibility and love, and is interested in the preservation of life. This expression emphasizes that an authentic love relationship always includes costly giving of self. But the emphasis is on the love, not on the cost, or the cross to be borne. Think of your own love relationships. Every committed love relationship has its price, right? Every loving relationship costs us something. It's that self-surrender to love that I'd like to propose is more freeing language to talk about what Jesus did on the cross and beyond. One image that concretizes such a self-surrender to love in the fourth gospel is that of a friend who lays down his life for his friends out of love, John 15:13. That image builds on what Jesus has said earlier in the gospel, using the metaphor of a good shepherd, where he says that no one takes his life from him. He lays it down of his own accord, John 10:17-18. And then there's another image, that of the friend who lays down his life for his friends. And this comes to a climactic moment in chapter 11, where Jesus receives the news that his friend Lazarus is ill. 3 times in that chapter, Jesus' love for Mary, Martha, and Lazarus is emphasized. And when Jesus does finally decide to go to them, his disciples protest that his opponents there in Jerusalem had just been trying to stone him. You remember Thomas gets a great line in this chapter. Thomas gets some really good one-liners, but he doesn't have much to say in this gospel, but what he says is really important. So Thomas, you remember what he says in this chapter? He says, "Oh great, let's all go die with him." And that's literally true. In this gospel, it's Jesus' raising of his friend Lazarus that's the final straw that's going to lead to his death. adopting an understanding of the cross as a friend who is willing to risk death for the beloved friend, this can have profound consequences, not just in our theological thinking, but in actual life. So I want to share with you a true story that was told to me more than once when I had the opportunity to visit in Chiapas, in the southernmost state of Mexico. And there is a very vibrant group of grassroots women's Bible study groups. This movement was initiated by Don Samuel Ruiz, who was Bishop of San Cristobal de las Casas from 1960 till 2000. And it has thrived, first under the direction of women religious in the diocese, and now increasingly more and more lay women. So the women had begun to learn how to read the scriptures con ojos, mente y corazón de mujer, with the eyes, mind, and heart of a woman. So here's confession time. I stole their phrase for the title of this talk. So I met with some of the women from these groups, and as these women were beginning to read the scriptures con ojos, mente y corazón de mujer, they began asking questions that were challenging the patriarchal underpinnings of their faith and the patterns of their daily lives. One woman had been attending a Bible study meeting, and when she returned home, her husband was drunk and enraged because she wasn't there to serve him his coffee when he wanted it. And so he beat her very badly, as he had many times before. The next morning, when her friends saw her battered face and her bruised body, they decided that it was finally time to act. They knew that they themselves could suffer repercussions from their own husbands and others for their actions. Nonetheless, they knew it was the moment when they had to lay down their lives for their friend. So some 30 women came together to the house to confront the husband. They informed him that if he ever struck her again, it would be he who would have the battered face and the bruised body. Now, I wish I could tell it differently. I try to work toward nonviolent confrontation. But it's a true story, so I have to tell you the way it happened. So what happened is these women had moved away from emulating the silent, suffering Jesus of Mark's gospel, just bearing all the abuse. And they had become a community of friends who, like the Johannine Jesus, were ready to lay down their own lives for their friend. Now, in this particular instance, I'm happy to report that the result was a happy one. The husband was so shocked by their intervention that he got the help that he needed to stop drinking and cease beating his wife. So the way we read really has important consequences. I want to focus our attention now on one other Johannine metaphor that I think has great liberative potential. And that is the depiction of Jesus' death as a birthing into new life. Come with me to the crucifixion scene in John's Gospel. And when we get there, in chapter 19, verse 34, we note that there's one unique feature that's not in the other Gospels, and that is where Jesus has just died and a soldier pierces his side. And what comes forth? Blood and water. Now, blood and water are highly symbolic. They're the same liquids, aren't they, that accompany the birthing process. This can help us interpret Jesus' death as a birthing into new life. Now, this scene brings to a climax a theme that weaves all the way through the gospel. And I don't think that the evangelist expects us to see the scene at the foot of the cross with the blood and water coming from Jesus' side and instantly understand, oh, that's about birthing into new life. the evangelist actually takes the whole gospel to set us up so that we can see this. First of all, another unique detail that we have in John's account, only in this gospel do we have the mother of Jesus at the foot of the cross. There's one other scene in which she appears in the fourth gospel. You'll remember it's at the wedding feast at Cana in chapter 2. The two scenes are like bookends for the whole gospel that help interpret everything in between, and the one scene helps us interpret the other scene. So at Cana, this is the moment at which Jesus' mother, the one who has given him physical birth, this is the moment at which she now serves as a kind of midwife for the birthing of his public ministry. You remember it's at Cana that he first manifests himself and that his disciples first begin to believe. Believing is the big word in the fourth gospel, as you know. And so the one who gave him physical birth helps to birth. She recognizes the right time. Remember, Jesus says, "My hour has not yet come." She says, he'll come around. She knows it's the right time. Just as Jesus will say, just at the start of chapter 13, the Passion narrative, "My hour has come." He knew that his hour had come. And so the two scenes are going to help us understand the birthing of of the community, of the renewed community of beloved disciples that will be birthed through the death of Jesus. Now, that theme of birthing, though, begins even before chapter 2, and that is already in the prologue. Verses 3 and 4 say, all things were birthed through him meaning the Logos, meaning Christ. Now, your translation may say, all things came into being through him, but the verb egeneton also means, look, all things were born through him. And then further on in verses 12 and 13, but to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave the power to become children of God. That's the same verb as above. But here it's a different verb now. Who were born, now it's son, not of blood or of the will or of the flesh or the will of man, but of God. So already the evangelist is planting that theme of how do we get birthed as children of God. And in the third chapter, the dialogue continues when Jesus meets with Nicodemus. And there are 7 instances in that chapter where that verb genao, to be born, occur. Jesus tells Nicodemus, no one can enter the kingdom of God without being born of water and spirit. Now the symbols of water and spirit, again, link us to the crucifixion scene, where the meaning of birth in water and spirit comes clearer. At Jesus' death in this gospel, in chapter 19, verse 30, he hands over the Spirit as water flows from his pierced side in 1934. Just as in Ezekiel 36, 25 to 27, where Ezekiel proclaims, speaking for God, I will sprinkle clean water upon you, and a new spirit I will put within you. The symbols of water and spirit signal a rebirth accomplished by divine action. The symbol of water is central to the next chapter, too, where Jesus offers the woman of Samaria living water and elaborates, those who drink of the water I give them will never be thirsty. The water that I will give will become in them a spring of living water gushing up to eternal life. And then the meaning of that living water is further developed in chapter 7, in the scene during the Feast of the Dedication, when Jesus exclaims, let anyone who is thirsty come to me, and let the one who believes in me drink. As the scripture has said, out of the believer's heart shall flow rivers of living water. Now, let's pause on verse 38 for just a moment. First of all, where's the living water coming from? Mickey McGrath, whose art I like a lot, paints the water flowing from Jesus' heart. But the word heart in Greek, cardia, you hear cardiac in there, right? Cardia, That's not the word that's in the Greek text. You did bring your Greek New Testament with you, didn't you? So it's not the word that's in the Greek text. The word in the Greek text is koilia, which means uterus, means womb. So out of the womb of whom? Of Jesus or the believer? You notice the NRSV says out of the believer. So it says out of the believer's heart. Well, it's not heart, it's womb. Sometimes a translation will fudge and will say from inside. Okay, we're not going to distinguish which organ, but that's a way to fudge it. It's out of the believer's womb, out of Jesus' womb, flow the rivers of living water. I think it's deliberately ambiguous, that it's not just out of Jesus that the living waters flow, that anyone who believes in Jesus also is a conduit of the living waters. Now, I'm, maybe not in this group, but other groups look at me kind of like, what are you talking about? A male Jesus having a womb? How can that be? What are you talking about? This is getting a little too silly. Well, remember that in this gospel, so much of the language is highly symbolic, highly metaphorical. And I'd like to propose that the way that you can have a male Jesus with a womb and giving birth is the same way that you can have a father with a bosom nursing the tender infant at the breast, like at the end of the prologue in John 1:18. In John, the whole prologue ends with trying to formulate for us how is it that even as Theos, God, has poured God's self out in love, as the Logos, as Christ takes on human flesh, that even though God and Theos and Logos were one from the beginning, and as God pours out God's love in the incarnation, even then they are still one and still so tenderly united. The end of the prologue says, the only Son who is, now this translation is really so inadequate. The only Son who is close to the Father's heart. No, I'm sorry. In Greek, it's eston kolpon tu patros, at the Father's breast. It's an image of tremendous intimacy about how the Theos, God, and the Logos are still intimately one, like a nursing child at its mother's breast. That same exact image comes up in the Last Supper scene. Fast forward to chapter 13, verse 23, where we have Jesus at the Last Supper, and the one whom Jesus loved was, here again, very inadequate translation. Reclining next to him? No. Literally, it says, en to kolpo tu Jesu, at the breast of Jesus. That's where the beloved disciple is. Now you're thinking, oh, lucky him. Well, lucky us. The beloved disciple is never named in that gospel. I know a lot of people think it was John, and in another lecture I can explain why it isn't. That disciple is never named. That disciple can be any of us. Every disciple can be the disciple that loves Jesus the most and is most beloved by Jesus, and that puts our head at the breast of Jesus. Just like Jesus' mother is never named in this gospel. We only know her name from the other gospels. She's always called the mother of Jesus in this gospel. And so, any of us can also be the bearer of the Christ, as she was. So when we read 738 in light of the crucifixion scene, we can see that the life-giving mission birthed by Jesus is carried forward now by believers who are not mere receptacles for living water, but are themselves conduits of it. So the use of this metaphor of birthing becomes most explicit when we get to chapter 16, to the farewell discourse, where Jesus speaks to his disciples about his impending passion. He says, "Very truly I tell you, you will weep and mourn, but the world will rejoice. You will have pain, but your pain will be turned into joy. When a woman is in labor, she has pain because her hour has come. But when her child is born, she no longer remembers the anguish because of the joy of having brought a human being into the world. So you have pain now, but I will see you again, and your hearts will rejoice, and no one can take your joy from you." So I know there are some women in this room who have given birth. I've asked my two sisters who have each borne 4 children. I said, "So is it true? Do you forget?" And my sisters both said, "Oh, yeah." Because we did it again, right? But they knew, and you know, and Jesus was drawing on our experience. You forget the labor pains because of the joy of the new life. The whole attention is on the love and the new life. But you can't get there without the labor pains. Jesus didn't just make this one up. He knew his Bible very well. And I'm sure he also knew the God described by Isaiah, who was laboring to rebirth Israel after the exile. "For a long time I have held my peace, I have kept still and restrained myself," says Isaiah. "Now I will cry out like a woman in labor. I will gasp and pant." Presenting Jesus' death as birth pangs, then, the fourth evangelist places the focus on the ensuing joy at the new life. The suffering is not an end in itself, nor is it for atonement for sins. So returning to John 19:34, we can envision not only Jesus' mother, but the other women who are at the foot of the cross as midwives who aid in the birthing of the renewed community. And when we hear Jesus' final declaration in this gospel, remember this one, he doesn't say, my God, why have you forsaken me?" His last words in this gospel are, "It is finished." Maybe we can hear that as the kind of declaration a mother makes who might cry out in joy when the birth pangs are over and the child is born. And when the body is taken down from the cross in this gospel, it is wrapped in linen cloths. Now I'm going to violate staying with the Gospel of John, which I would urge you to stay with the symbolism of that gospel. I'm going to violate that principle and just pull on an image from Luke's gospel. You remember that when the newborn Jesus was born in Luke's gospel, they wrapped him in swaddling clothes, similar to that image of wrapping the body in linen cloths when taken down from the cross in John. And then when the risen Christ appears to the disciples for the first time in chapter 20, and he breathes on them and says, "Receive the Holy Spirit." It's like the moment of birthing of the first human being in Genesis, when the Creator breathed into its nostrils the breath of life and it became a living being. And finally, the image of the open tomb can symbolize the open womb from which the new life has emerged. Now by this time, probably not in this group, but other groups by this time are usually thinking, yeah, you gotta be a 21st century feminist to see all that in the Gospel of John. And I wish I could say that it was our new insights, but it's not. As early as the turn of the 3rd century, already many of our church fathers were seeing this same kind of birthing imagery in the crucifixion. Clement of Alexandria wrote about the body of Christ, which nourishes by the word the young brood which the Lord himself brought forth in throes of flesh, which the Lord himself swathed in his precious blood. And then he exclaims, "Oh, amazing birth." Similarly, Ambrose Bishop of Milan in the 4th century, refers to Christ as the Virgin who bore us, who fed us with her own milk. Julian of Norwich says that Jesus, our Savior, is our true mother, in whom we are endlessly born and out of whom we shall come. I have to throw in a Dominican. German Dominican mystic and scholar Meister Eckhart mused, what does God do all day long? You know what his answer was? God lies on a maternity bed giving birth all day long. So I began by saying that for the new life to come forth that God is birthing in us now, we will need to choose to die to former modes of consciousness and ways of being. Reading the scriptures with a feminist consciousness and accepting the world as science now discloses it, we can see that, as Ilia Delio says, Jesus' death and resurrection speak to us of new and transformed life at the heart of the universe. What happens in Jesus anticipates the future life of the cosmos, that is, transformed life in God. We see in Jesus the power of the future and the anticipation of cosmic transformation. So I want to suggest that the symbol of birthing of new life is far more than a nice way to think about Jesus' death. Rather, it confronts us with the challenge to replicate in our own lives the actions and attitudes of Christ, who came to engender new life to the full for all, as he says in John 10:10. It invites us into relationships where the gift of self is loving, mutual, and self-replicating, where suffering has meaning and value, not as a consequence of sin or the price to be paid to an angry God, but as the labor pangs that must be gone through in order to bring forth the new life. Furthermore, the symbol of Christ birthing the renewed community of beloved disciples enhances the ability of female Christians to see ourselves as bearing the image of Christ in our world, but it is not one that excludes males. Finally, when we appropriate the moral sense of these texts that speak of birthing, this can lead to actions, both individual and communal, that aim to take down from the cross the crucified persons of our day, as we act as co-creators with God in a cosmos that is ever birthing beauty, goodness, and delight. For many years, feminist biblical scholars have been leading the way in developing these methods of reading the scriptures. In these critical times, it is now more important than ever that we learn to read the scriptures in such ways that enable the flourishing of women, men, children, and all creation. So thank you.